Hello there, welcome back to Scot Goes Pop. My name is James Kelly. Now, as I said in a recent video, considerable progress has been made towards recognition of the State of Palestine by key Western states, including France, the UK, and Canada. And we're already starting to see the sort of domino effect of that, with, for example, Finland saying it might fall into line with recognition. But if France and Canada in particular have both said that recognition is effectively going to be contingent on Palestine being a demilitarized state. And Mahmoud Abbas, the president of Palestine, has indicated his willingness to go along with that. But this is curious, of course, because there'll be no need, apparently, for Israel to be a demilitarized state, and yet Israel are the perpetrators of the genocide, and Palestine are the victims of the genocide. And so it's this curious situation where the imperative seems to be to protect the perpetrators of the genocide from their own victims, which is certainly not what happened in the mid-20th century with the worst genocide of the 20th century when Germany was defeated and Germany was demilitarized for a long period of time. It was denazified and it was thoroughly democratized. So I suppose the modern equivalent of that would be Israel would be occupied by the international community, so to speak, and it would be disarmed, it would be demilitarized. All the political parties that were involved in the genocide, Likud and the far-right coalition partners, they would probably be banned from politics. But no, none of that will happen. Israel will be allowed to carry on just as before, as if nothing had happened. And it'll be Palestine that will be demilitarized and left helpless. And as a number of people pointed out, if you leave Palestine helpless, it's just a matter of time before Israel do the same thing over and over again, invade again, commit genocide again, whatever. But what that means in practice is if it ever got to the point of there being a proper settlement where this recognition of the State of Palestine wasn't just an abstract concept, but the State of Palestine actually exercised full sovereignty over its territory, went into an agreement with Israel. If Palestine was expected to be demilitarized while its neighbour and its attacker is left fully armed, then there would have to be security guarantees for Palestine. I mean, it may seem unthinkable that Western countries would commit to defending Palestine against Israel, would commit to going to war with Israel in certain circumstances, but there would have to be those agreements on paper. Otherwise, how can you possibly make those demands of Palestine to be demilitarized? Security guarantees would probably be worthless in the same way that the security guarantees to Czechoslovakia in the 1930s were worthless, but nevertheless, they would be there on paper. And then we come to the point that Israel is also a nuclear weapons power. Now think about the logic, for the stated logic anyway, for Britain having nuclear weapons, which I know that even some Scot Goes Pop readers agree with, which I find extremely surprising. They actually do buy into this whole concept of deterrence works, that if there is a credible threat, if there is a power out there like Russia that could credibly threaten the UK and that has nuclear weapons, then we need our own nuclear weapons to deter this aggressor. As long as that's a credible threat, that apparently makes sense to people. Well, what country in the world, other than Palestine, faces a more credible threat from a nuclear weapons state? It's already been demonstrated that the nuclear weapons state has enough animosity, to put it mildly, against the Palestinian people to commit genocide against it. So if any country is at real risk of nuclear attack or nuclear annihilation, if any country needs protection against that through a so-called deterrent, then it's Palestine. So the logic, if there's a logic for Britain having an independent nuclear deterrent, the logic for Palestine having an independent nuclear deterrent is absolutely overwhelming. Now, of course, it won't be allowed to have such a thing. But then you get to the logic that applies to countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, which have agreed not to have their own nuclear weapons in return for so-called nuclear weapons sharing within NATO. In other words, they would be guaranteed to be protected, so-called protected by the deterrence of other NATO countries that do have nuclear weapons. And so if the logic again implies that because Palestine is this very grave special threat from a neighboring country that has nuclear weapons, if you're going to expect Palestine to be demilitarized, to be completely helpless, and it would need to be covered by some sort of nuclear deterrent from elsewhere. Now, if you would sort of instinctively react to that by thinking that actually you can't do that because you might actually have to use nuclear weapons against Israel, then you might want to have a think about whether that means the deterrent effect isn't quite what you think it is. You apply that logic to Britain and think it makes us safer, but then you apply that logic to Palestine and you don't think it actually deters an attack and the weapons might have to be used. And you think about Jo Swinson in the run-up to the 2019 general election where she made that extraordinary comment on Channel 4 News where she just boasted with this kind of really swagger about her, about how oh yeah, she would press a nuclear button. She wouldn't think twice about annihilating millions upon millions of men, women, and children. Would she say the same thing if she was being asked about whether she would push the button if she was under pressure to fulfill a treaty commitment to Palestine to protect it against nuclear attack from Israel in retaliation to an Israeli nuclear attack on Palestine? Would she push the button? Can you imagine her actually boasting about being this mass murderer and how she wouldn't think twice about it if she was talking about directing these weapons against the world's only Jewish state? Because that would effectively she'd be talking about annihilating the Jewish population on the same sort of level in the same numbers as Adolf Hitler. And if she wouldn't have said that, and of course she wouldn't, if it had been framed like that, then perhaps we should ask ourselves, is it really appropriate to be talking in such boastful terms about committing mass murder against, say, Russians? That would be the implication. She's talking about mass murdering Russian men, women, and children. So if your instinctive reaction is that deterrence, nuclear deterrence for the state of Palestine wouldn't work, it wouldn't deter a nuclear attack, it wouldn't make a nuclear attack less likely, and it wouldn't be morally acceptable to retaliate to such a nuclear attack anyway, then perhaps, you want to take a step back and think, well, does any of that logic really work when it's Britain vis-a-vis Russia? If deterrence doesn't work in one context, why do you think it works in another? Sometimes if you sort of take a step back and apply principles that you only usually apply in one context and apply them in another context instead, you can suddenly see the whole sort of house of cards fall apart, and you can suddenly see why those principles don't really work. That deterrence is bogus, that retaliation to nuclear weapons by committing a worse genocide, a worse Holocaust than anything Hitler did, it's not morally acceptable, and it's not morally acceptable to sit on Channel 4 News boasting about it, boasting about the prospect of doing it. So that's just a little thought I wanted to leave you with. That's it for now, but if you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you later.